Could we bring in Mr. Hall? Good afternoon, Mr. Hall. We hope we've solved the technical issue over providing you with copy documents on the screen, but should that issue re-emerge, the fallback plan is to provide it paper. So you should have the document one way or the other. Mr. McLaren.
Thank you, Lord. You remember just before lunch, Mr. Hall, that we were looking at email exchange in which you had sought clarification from the board about certain humidification requirements. Yeah. If we could have it on the screen, please, the environmental matrix start of the preferred bidder period, which is bundle 4, page 132. Blow that up so we can see it. If you can scroll up a little bit so we can see the whole of guidance note 15, please. Can we just look slightly further down that so that we can see the whole of guidance note 15 on the screen? Thank you. Now, did you see in guidance note 15, Mr. Hall, about four lines down within the high dependency unit section, comment there about central AHU plant requires humidification. See that? Yeah. Again, if you look in the critical care section, you see a similar comment about humidification. Was it your understanding that the query passed on to the board about humidification related to those guidance notes?
I'm not sure if it was a guidance note. So we were having weekly workshops, and the design intent was getting developed by Wallace Whittle, and I seem to recall there was a discussion about humidification, and I think Wallace Whittle went back to the office to reflect on it, and then this is where the RFI came from.
Okay. I can maybe put it a slightly different way. Do you understand that the question you put to the board about humidification covered the same issue as is covered by what's said about humidification in the guidance notes?
Yes, I can see that now, yeah.
Okay, so is it correct then to see that, or correct then to say that this is an example of Wallace Whittle raising a query which relates to guidance note 15, the environmental matrix?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if they took it from there or whether they took it from, the actual guidance. I'm not sure where they took that from.
But certainly, at this stage, there doesn't appear to have been any request for clarification about the discrepancy that arises from the guidance note, insofar as it talks about 10 air changes per hour, HDU or critical care.
No, because we weren't aware there was a discrepancy, as far as I'm aware.
If you could go please to bundle 10, volume 2, page 1300. You see two emails here, Mr. Hall. The bottom one is from you to Maureen Brown, Graham Greer, both of Mock MacDonald, I think. Is that correct? Dated the 3rd of July 2014, so a few months into your work on the project. Your email reads, "Good morning, Mo, Graham. Stuart has asked if you have the environmental matrix in Excel rather than PDF version to allow to populate the schedule with any changes. Stuart there, Stuart McKechnie of Wallace Whittle.
Yeah.
Why had Mr. McKechnie asked for the environmental matrix?
Well, we knew that there was a requirement to provide the environmental matrix for the financial close, and Wallace Whittle weren't now getting into a position to allow that process to happen. So the starting point was obviously to take the board's environmental matrix in Excel format, allow that process to conclude for the financial close.
And your email talks about Mr. McKechnie having it allowed to populate the schedule with any changes. So was it your expectation that Mr. McKechnie would be making changes to the environmental matrix?
Only if changes had come out from the discussions with the board that required any changes. I mean, at that point, we were obviously working together. The board and Wallace Whittle and Multiplex, and we were, you know, trying to get all the ducks in a row to deliver what we had. So at that point, there was no envisaged changes, but we knew, given the experience in hospital work, that could be user group meetings, it could be discussions around the environmental matrix that the board wanted to make changes. It's just, you know, I think looking into that, it's not a statement to say, provide it so we make changes.
So when you were asking for the environmental matrix at that time, as far as you recall, you didn't have any particular changes in mind, or even that changes might happen at all. Is that correct?
I think it was open-minded. It was just basically, we knew we had an end date, we had to have these documents prepared and ready, and we were using our experience to start to show that the process was moving in the right direction. But if there had been any changes proposed at that point, they would have been listed or discussed or detailed.
Okay. If you could go please to bundle 13 at page 157. This is in the middle of the witness statement, the inquiry from Graham Greer of McDonald. And I'm just going to read from what he says at paragraph 79. He says, the development of the environmental matrix, the preferred bidder to financial close phase, started with a discussion on transferring the ownership of the environmental matrix, IHSL. I recall being involved in a conversation to the effect, now IHSL's environmental matrix, and was for IHSL to develop, following which, on the 3rd of July 2015, IHSL asked for an Excel version of the environmental matrix in order that they could develop it in accordance with their own design. That appears to be a reference to the email that we've just looked at. Do you agree or disagree with how Mr. Greer describes events?
Well, the wording used in terms of transferring the ownership, I'm not sure who that discussion was with, but it wasn't with me. I think there's anything else relevant.
So, if he may not have had that discussion with you, but his description of this marking the moment when ownership of the environmental matrix transferred over to IHSL, do you agree with that, or do you?
That the ownership was transferring on the 3rd of July? I mean,
Yes, that the fact you had asked for an Excel version of the environmental matrix in order to be able to make changes to it, do you agree that that marked the moment when the environmental matrix became a document that IHSL were responsible for the contents of.
No, I don't agree.
Don't agree with that?
No.
And what about the statement that part of the purpose of this was to allow IHSL to develop the environmental matrix in accordance with their own design? Is that correct or incorrect?
I'm just trying to find out.
That's just the last sentence.
Last sentence. All in all, actually, I produced at least 11 to that statement.
Oh, sorry, that's my mistake. I've referred you to the wrong bit. It's the reason for the confusion is it's the last part of the bit that I've highlighted on my own version. Actually, from the third line, he says, I recall being involved in a conversation to the effect that it was now IHSL's environmental matrix for IHSL to develop, following which, on the 3rd of July 2014, IHSL asked for an Excel version of the environmental matrix. It's this last bit that I'm interested in order that they could develop it in accordance with their own design. Do you agree or disagree that the point of asking for the matrix in Excel format so that IHSL could develop it in accordance with their design?
Disagree.
Disagree with that?
Yeah.
You'd raised the possibility of changes to the environmental matrix. In what circumstances did you envisage changes might be made to the environmental matrix?
Well, as I've said earlier, we have the issue of our user groups, and if there was any changes with that, if there were any issues coming out of where we were progressing design, and a good example for it is the actual single bedroom and positive or negative pressure. So a discussion was had in that, we may well come on to it, but ultimately what was concluded was that the board's environmental matrix was not what they wanted for positive pressure, was they wanted negative or balanced. And so that's an example of a change that was driven by the board, and the environmental matrix was changed.
You're describing there envisaging changes, I've understood it, prompted by decision making on the part of the board.
Yeah.
Would you envisage any or did you at the time envisage any circumstances in which changes to the environmental matrix would be proposed by IHSL?
I mean, to be honest, it wasn't a high-level thought process that we need to get this environmental matrix to change it. It was simply we knew we had an obligation to, for financial close, have the document as part of a pack, and perhaps as that process progressed, there may well be changes. But changes, definition of changes, I think, can be misunderstood in terms of, as we spoke earlier about the sort of schedule of accommodation or an additional room added. You're not changing the fundamental requirements that the board have asked you for per room type on their environmental requirements.
Now, it appears to be the case that sometime between getting the environmental matrix in Excel form and October, Wallace Whittle produced a version of the environmental matrix. If we could go please to bundle 4, page 218. Do you recognise this document?
Yeah.
Just explain to us what this document is, please.
So effectively, Wallace Whittle took the Hulling-Kirkwood environmental matrix and then converted it into a document that we would be submitting at financial close. And then that was then, it was labelled as draft, and it was put back to the board for comment. And the output of that was got a range of comments down the left-hand side. And with those comments, they were given to Wallace Whittle to then respond to. And they responded to them, and then we asked for a meeting. I think that was sent back in about the 27th or 28th of October, and then we had a meeting the day after. And the purpose was to go through these comments to see where we had to go from there.
Okay, so in this table, do we see the comments from the board summarised in the left-hand column, and then the responses by Wallace Whittle on behalf of IHSL down the right-hand column? Is that what this shows?
Yeah.
Now, if your understanding at that time was that the environmental matrix set out the board's requirements and was a completed document, what did you make of the fact the board had made these technical comments about it?
Yeah, I mean, I've said in my statement that I thought maybe somebody had reviewed the matrix that perhaps hadn't been involved in the project. That was my initial thoughts. However, it showed that the document was getting reviewed, and so overall it was a positive thing, and that's what we wanted.
Did it indicate to you that the environmental matrix might not, after all, set out a finalised set of the board's requirements?
Not at that point. Because it's in draft format going back, it's all about the sort of daft laddie questions and trying to get people's comments to then have dialogue and discussions and see if, what comments are really material and we need to do something with, and because you're also expecting somebody to review documents that perhaps don't have the full picture.
On any view, we're in the middle of a process here where the environmental matrix sent out with the tender documents is undergoing a process of review.
Yeah.
We go over to the second page of that document. And you just take board's comments, so that's the left-hand column, 7 and 8. You just take a moment to read those, please, Mr. Hall. Let me know once you've read them.
Yep.
So do we see there that the board is raising concerns about the compliance of the environmental matrix with SHTM 0301?
Well, it's a comment that's detailed, which do refer to the SHTM, yes.
Yeah, they don't just refer to it, but they highlight that the parameters in the environmental matrix differ from those recommended by SHTM 301. Is that not right?
Yeah, well, they're doing a comparison between the matrix and the SHTM.
But this suggests that the board is concerned that the environmental matrix might not be compliant with SHTM 0301. Perhaps more importantly, that they wanted it to comply with SHTM 0301.
No, I didn't read it as that. My initial thoughts were this is somebody who's reviewed this that doesn't fully understand the board's requirements in terms of what's in the matrix. And sometimes on projects, you know, back at the office, you could give somebody who's not been involved in the project a document to review, see what comes out of their findings, and then you would discuss it through.
Okay, we see from this document, this is the second and final page of it, and right at the bottom we've got comment number 12. We see that NHSL raised 12 queries in this document. Now, what, if anything, did you take from the fact that the board had raised these particular queries and no others?
Well, I guess there was two aspects. One was that it was positive that somebody was reviewing the document and giving comments back, but there was the issue over it. It was the client's document, but I think thinking back, it was about we've got 12 comments to conclude the environmental matrix. So let's have a meeting with the Wallace Whittle responses, see if we can get them resolved.
What, if anything, did you infer about the board's attitude to the parts of the environmental matrix on which they had not commented?
I wasn't thinking it in any detail. You know, there's a document that has been given to be reviewed, and so the assumption is it's been reviewed and you have 12 comments. We're working to financial close, so it was all about let's get the 12 comments refined down, and then that then draws a line under the environmental matrix.
Was there any indication given to you that the review being carried out, the environmental matrix, by and on behalf of the board, was only a sample review, didn't extend to all elements of the environmental matrix?
No.
In your witness statement, you describe NHSL's technical advisors, Mott MacDonald, as resourcing the project. This is a quote from your statement, almost like a shadow design team. And the reference for the transcript is paragraph 43 of your statement, bundle 13, page 248. I'd just like to clarify this if I can. I think from the use of the word almost, don't mean that Mott MacDonald actually were a shadow design team. Is that correct?
Yeah, if I can just get the item on the screen, Matt. Which paragraph is it?
It's paragraph 43, I think on page. Looks like I've possibly got the wrong. It's page 248, and it's paragraph 43 of yours. I think that's probably Mr. Greer's statement that we've got on the screen at the moment. Page 248, bundle 13. And it's at the top of that page, Mr. Hall. Mott MacDonald were really front and centre in their capacity as technical advisors to the board. They introduced themselves at each of the meetings as technical advisors to the board. We were liaising with the board through Mott MacDonald. Useful that they brought people in who were designers in the relevant work stream, so it was not administrators. The way that they resourced it was almost like a shadow design team. And what I was seeking to clarify, and I think because you used the word almost like a shadow design team, you don't mean to suggest that they were in fact a shadow design team. Is that correct?
Yeah, so, I mean, the shadow design team is I think it is a defined term in EBA, where a project is led by a contractor in terms of the design. And I've been involved in projects before where contractor employs their design team, client has their design team, and they're called a shadow design team. And their role is all about compliance with the contractor's design. And so my experience of it very much was that you had a project manager, then you had strands of quite kind of senior people who were competent in their discipline, and that's what would shadow you. Take what we had on this project. We had, for instance, the mechanical and electrical. Wallace Whittle had split it up, energy, electrical, mechanical. We also had architectural, structural, civil, helipad, fire. If you think of an organogram, each one of those elements all coming in, there was somebody shadowing each package. They were reporting in to a project manager. So on the M&E side, what it felt to me was that when so electrically we had Willie Stevenson, on energy we had Andrew Holey, and on the mechanical we had Colin Cray. In the workshops that we had to project them all ahead so that those particular specialists came to the meetings. And Wallace Whittle would almost be presenting what they had done. And there was discussion. But it was all positive. When I use the word shadow design team, that's just, I think the question when I was at the interview was just about relationships with MOTS, and that's how I described it. So I don't know the contractual arrangements. It's just, my observations and feelings based on my experience in other projects.
Okay. But ultimately, responsibility for the design rested with IHSL.
Yeah.
If you could go back, please, to the document at Bundle 4, page 218. Possibly it's page 219. And looking in particular at the comment at number 7. What it says there is bedrooms 4 air changes per hour, SHTM says 6 air changes per hour. Then a few lines further down, bedrooms stated as positive pressure, SHTM says, I think we'll read that as balanced or negative pressure. What bedrooms did you understand those comments to relate to?
Just a standard bedroom in a ward.
Would you accept that the comment was not intended to relate to bedrooms in critical care?
It doesn't mention critical care. It's difficult to know.
Well, the apparent purpose of the comment to reflect the requirements of SHTM. Agree with that?
Yep.
And the requirements of SHTM for critical care are 10 air changes per hour and positive pressure. Get that?
Yep.
So it would seem on the face of it that these comments are about standard bedrooms, not critical care bedrooms.
Yeah, I can see that.
Is that how you understood it at the time?
I didn't go into in that level of detail. It was more about we have 12 comments to resolve. Let's get together, talk about it. You know, it's clear, obviously, that we're being open and honest. We're taking their comments and we're responding as to how our interpretation of it. But that was very much to then discuss and agree what the concerns were.
Okay. And if we read the response from Wallace Whittle in the right-hand column, it says the scheme is based on the reference design throughout, essentially mixed mode, openable windows, 2/3 mechanical supply air to all bedrooms. And reading on a bit, we've amended the environmental schedule to show the room being balanced, which is provided by the opening window. So we see there that change is being made to the environmental matrix so that it complies with SHTM 0301.
Based on the client flagging that up as an issue.
Yeah. We go then to bundle 4 at page 20. And this is the environmental matrix from the 31st of October 2014. So it's the one issued by Wallace Whittle at that time. I understand it in response to those comments. So do we see from the first page there that the Hulley and Kirkwood logo has gone, first of all?
Yeah.
Is that a change that Wallace Whittle made at that time?
Yeah. So looking back, the comments that Wallace Whittle had responded to, I think, were about the 27th or the 28th of October. And the next day, we had a meeting to discuss these comments. And then Wallace Whittle went away based on the discussions and agreement, and then updated this matrix to reflect that.
Okay, and the removal of the Hulley and Kirkwood logo, that reflect the fact that this is no longer regarded as a Hulley and Kirkwood document, but it's actually an IHSL document.
I didn't pay much attention to it. It was a request by the board in their left-hand column. One of the points says to remove it, and therefore, in simplistic terms, Wallace Whittle are doing what they're being told.
Okay, and responsibility for correctly implementing the board's comments, would that rest with IHSL?
In terms of being asked to remove that, thinking.
So the changes that have been made to the environmental matrix following the comments at the end of October, responsibility for getting that right, correctly implementing the board's requirements, that now rests with IHSL?
Yes.
We go to page 221, please. And down at the bottom of that page, we see guidance note 26.
Yep.
Just take a moment to read that, please. Does that relate to the comments made by the board? The note we looked at a moment ago.
Yeah, well, based on the comments at the meeting, in the 6 versus the 4, our interpretation was that the reference design was the board's construction requirements, and that's what was required.
And does this guidance note 26 appears in this version but not the earlier version? And what I'm just interested in knowing is whether this relates to the comments that the board had made at the end of October. Is that why this guidance note appears?
Yeah, so there were think there might have been 3 comments added, but 24 to 26, but it was about after the meeting, Wallace Whittle updated it and what they understood the board were asking for, and this clarity was added in the single bedroom. And if you were to go to the actual bedroom environmentals in the table, you would see that it had been changed to balanced and the 4-year changes remained.
If we look back up to guidance note 15, please. We see there that the comments we looked at a moment ago in the earlier version of the matrix about humidification, do we see that those comments have been changed?
Yeah, which was based on the RFI request. So again, it's getting put back to the board to say this is what you've asked for, and we're asking for it to be confirmed that that's what you definitely want, and that's the opportunity to then confirm or otherwise that it is what they want.
So these 2 changes we're looking at here, those have been made by Wallace Whittle in response to particular points raised by the board at the meeting in October.
Yeah.
We might just note while we're here that guidance note 15's reference to tenure changes in high dependency and critical care, those remain in place. See that?
Yeah.
And it's, yeah. If we go on to page 222, please. This is the room function reference sheet, which I think you said earlier was a document you didn't pay much attention to. If we look, you'll recall that in the earlier version, there was an entry here for high dependency unit. But if we look at this version, the entry for the high dependency unit has been removed. Take it from me, that's the case. It doesn't appear in that list. Can we take it from your earlier answers that that's something you were not aware of at the time?
Not aware of that.
If we go on to page 226, please. And if we could scroll out a little bit so we can read the text. Sorry, scroll in. And if we look further down that page a little bit, please. So we see, sorry, go back. Sorry, I've lost my bearings. I think if you scroll downwards, go to the bottom of that page. That's great, thank you, stop there. You see at the left-hand side, the reference B1, PQ and HDU, so that's the critical care department.
Yep.
Okay. And if we scroll back up a little bit, stop there, that's fine, thank you. And we can, if it's possible to scroll out a little bit so we can still read it, but we can see more columns. Okay, this might be a little bit of a challenge. If you take it from me, Mr. Hall, that what we see here is that for bed areas in critical care, pressure has been changed from positive balanced. You may be able to see that if you take a moment or two. You see that?
Yeah.
if you take it from me that the pressure requirement for bedded areas in critical care, this version are stated as balanced, whereas in the previous version they stated as positive. Does that accord with your recollection from the time?
I don't remember, to be honest.
Okay, but if the bedded areas in critical care had been changed to be given a balanced pressure regime, do you agree that that's inconsistent with what SHTM 0301 requires for rooms in critical care?
Yep.
What SHTM 0301 requires for critical care rooms, generally speaking, positive pressure, but sometimes for isolation rooms might be negative. Is that right?
Yep.
Were you aware at the time that the pressure regime for single rooms in critical care had been changed in that way?
Don't have any recollection of it.
And just while we're here, we see that the air changes for the bedrooms in, or the bedded areas in care remain at 4 air changes per hour. Okay, if we could move now to a different document, which is Bundle 4, page 245. We may be facing a technical challenge. So just, I don't know if we can try again, just Bundle 4, page 245. Here we go, that's it. So we see here, Mr. Hall, an email from Graham Greer, Mott MacDonald, 11th of November 2014. And he's saying, "Dear all, notes attached from today's meeting." If we go down to page 247, please. These are the notes circulated by Mr. Greer. Is this a document that you recognise?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, please?
That was really the output of the meeting we had on the 11th of November, I think, whereby effectively we'd had the 12 points in the matrix at the previous meetings. That was now down to 7. Conclusion of that was that 7 points had to be incorporated into the environmental matrix, but there was time pressures because we were trying to get the financial close, and the view seemed to be, I recall, that they would be done after financial close.
Okay. And we don't need to look at it, but take it from me that wording either materially the same or exactly the same as that appears in the viewable design data schedule of the project agreement.
Yeah.
Does that seem right to you? Is that your recollection of what happened?
Yeah, we had these 7 points. My interpretation of it was we had 7 points to conclude with the matrix. That effectively then meant that we had an environmental matrix, was what the client's requirements were. That was that matter closed. And I think the 7 points went into, I think it was part 4 of the document, and that talks about the 7 points to be captured as part of RDD. Comments from the board.
RDD, viewable design data.
Yeah, so the 7 points had to come reviewable design data.
So just if I can attempt to just summarise that back, at the meeting in October, board's notes in October had raised about 12 points on the environmental matrix. Then the meeting on the 11th of November, which boiled those 12 points down to 7 that are on screen. Is that right?
Yeah, there was a meeting before then. So the first meeting we had was at the end of October, and then the matrix was updated on the last day of October, I think, and then had a further meeting on the 11th. Effectively, the matrix that we'd circulated on the 31st of October that took some of the points on board were then discussed again, and this was the remaining items that had to form part of RDD.
Okay. One point that appears in the October list, doesn't appear in this list, is the one about 6 air changes in bedrooms rather than 4. Do we take it from that that particular issue was resolved?
Yeah, so we had the meeting at the end of October. Wallace Whittle outlined the fact that it was the reference design and the client's requirements that required 4. So the matrix wasn't changed and 4 remained effectively on the latest environmental matrix. So ultimately the 4 was what we concluded was what the client required.
Okay, and what we also see from that list there is final bullet point on the list. No, sorry, that's the wrong one. It's the 4th bottom comment on that list, emerging from the meeting in November. Detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation to achieve balanced negative pressure relative to the corridor. That's the issue of bedroom pressure. That one remained unresolved as at that date.
Well, my interpretation of it was because the environmental matrix was changed, the original one had positive. Wallace Whittle updated the one for the 31st based on the discussions to balanced. Then the discussion was, as far as I was concerned, that was what the board wanted, but they just wanted to ensure what Wallace Whittle had spoke about was in fact what their understanding was. So, but the matrix was changed to be balanced.
Now, if we could move from that to bundle 8, page 64, please. See at the bottom here an email you from Leanne Edwards Scott, 19th of November 2014. Just to explain to us who Leanne Edwards Scott is.
Leanne Edwards Scott is a multiplex employee, a design manager.
This is about a week or so after the meeting, the outcome of which we've just seen. She's saying to you, MOTS have just informed the HAI scribe that the vent system doesn't comply with infection control because it relies on the windows being openable, shed some light or offer opinion. And just briefly, can you explain what that was about?
Yeah, so at the time, I was surprised to read this email, the week before we walked away thinking that we had 7 points through RDD and it was resolved, and then I opened this email to find that there was some meeting going on that I didn't know anything about. Somebody in the meeting was now starting to say that there was a compliance issue, so it was a concern given the timescales and the financial close elements, and so it wasn't clear what it was. But then I took the decision to say to Wallace Whittle to bring forward those sketches.
Okay, if we look higher up in the document, we'll need to straddle the 2 pages, but if we go up to page 63 first, see down at the bottom there, an email from you to Stuart McKechnie of Wallace Whittle. And what you say is, "Hi Stuart, can you treat as priority the bedroom sketches vent before the door closes? And we have no alternative but to comply with infection control requirements. Realistically, I think we need 1, interpretation of SHTM for bedrooms, 2, airflow movement under a few scenarios, natural vent, etc. And down the page, 3, how this impacts on adjacent corridor ventilation. We need to chat it through internally, table with infection control." And you just explained briefly what you were asking Mr. McKechnie to do.
Basically, the sketches and the discussions that he'd had at the previous meeting on the 11th, effectively I was asking them to pull them together, show really their design based on the reference design that had been worked up for the last 9 months, pair it against the SHTMs, and then what I wanted to do was to then table it with whoever it was that was raising it, because typically what can happen in these type of projects, you have a meeting where somebody says something, and then the next thing it's gospel. So what I wanted to do was, rather than emails or anything, I wanted the sketches prepared, and then I wanted to get whoever it was that was raising the issues to sit down with them, talk it through as to how the the reference design had been interpreted and compare it against the SHTM.
Okay. Now, your email refers to this as being an issue of compliance with infection control requirements. And you've asked Mr. McKechnie for an interpretation of SHTM. Was there any discussion or understanding around this time that the significance of air pressure for infection control might be different for critical care rooms was for standard rooms?
No, there was no discussion. I mean, infection control element came from the email from Leanne, which was vague. And in reality, the whole discussion, track it back to what I had on the screen earlier, it was about the single bedrooms.
And if we go to the top of page 63, you weren't copied in on this email. It's Stuart McKechnie, I think perhaps the colleagues of his. He says, "Told you wouldn't wait until our DDD," and so on. Do you know what he means?
Well, obviously, I can't speak for him, but my interpretation of that would be the meeting we had on the 11th, where they had discussed this particular element, and the agreement was that the sketches wouldn't be needed until after FC. Might be that, and so that's maybe RDD in relation to that.
Okay. The issue about air pressure carried on, and January 2015, Wallace Whittle sent you an air movement report. We could just go to that, please. It's the bundle 8, page 66. Do you remember this report?
Yeah.
Now, what did you take from this report?
Well, I took it that I'd prepared a kind of comparison with the STM. He was identifying the reference design type requirement, and then he was given various options on it.
Can I put it this way? Did you take it to resolve the query about pressure in single bedrooms?
Not until we had the discussions. You know, the point was to prepare something to then talk it through with whoever had raised it and to see if it was a genuine concern or if this was going to be acceptable.
Okay, if we could take a look at the conclusion, which is page 67. Just picking up from the second paragraph there, it says, when the windows and trickle vents are utilised for natural ventilation, bedroom pressure is balanced, corridor becomes negative. Some of the windows and trickle vents are closed, these bedrooms will become positive, bedrooms with open windows again will be balanced, corridor is negative. With all the bedroom windows closed, bedroom pressure is positive, corridor should be balanced, so on. Window trickle vents should be left open when the rooms are occupied. This will ensure that the bedroom pressure is balanced. Now, would it be fair to boil all that down to, if positive pressure in the bedrooms was to be avoided, windows or trickle vents would have to be left open? Is that your understanding of
Well, reading both paragraphs, should the bedroom windows and trickle vents be closed, bedroom pressure is positive, corridor shall be balanced. So my understanding was that by putting 4 into the bedroom, 4 air changes per hour with the windows closed, and then it was getting extracted through into the ensuite at a minimum 10, I think, then the intention was to have that balance to the corridor.
Yeah. Okay. Did you form any view at the time about whether this report applied to single rooms in the critical care department?
It didn't feature on my radar, critical care. Because again, the key point I guess to make here is that detailed design wasn't starting until after financial close.
Well, that would be detailed design, which on your understanding would be based on the parameters in the environmental matrix.
Yeah, so you'd be taking a single bedroom, for instance, you would be looking at the environmental matrix and you would be designing to achieve the requirements. So the duct sizing, the grills, everything that you need. So that work wasn't getting done before financial close, it was getting done after.
Okay. We could go please to page 78 of bundle 8. See at the bottom here an email from you to Maureen Brown of Mott MacDonald and Janice Mackenzie of NHSL. You're saying, and it's 19th of January 2015. As per meeting of Tuesday 13th January, our request for clarity on negative positive pressure regime within the bedrooms, we attach the sketches distributed at the meeting and seek confirmation acceptance from the NHS review of infection control. Can you just explain the purpose of your email, please?
Well, the purpose was that I was concerned, obviously, when we'd had that email through about the infection control element, that we had to resolve this because we wouldn't get financial close if we didn't have agreement. And what we were trying to do, based on the sketches and the presentation that Wallace Whittle gave, we're basically saying, in terms of the pressure, is this what you want?
Okay, and the reply is above. It appears to be from Maureen Brown at Mott MacDonald to you. It says, "Hi Ken, following your recent request for information, the board responds as follows. Single room with ensuite ventilation design shall comply with the parameters set out in SHTM 0301. Design solution does not rely in any way with opening windows, as these will be opened or closed by patient choice. Critical factor from SHTM 0301 for infection control be the resultant pressure within the room being balanced or with or negative to the corridor." And a comment about isolation room. So this exchange between you and Maureen Brown talks about bedrooms, but again doesn't clarify whether that also includes rooms in critical care. Did you consider that the exchange related to such bedrooms, or was it not something that you thought about?
It wasn't something I'd thought about.
And taking the clarification from the board, moving forward with it, did you apply that information to rooms in critical care? Or do you not know?
At that particular point, or are we talking about after financial close? Or
Well, at that particular point, first of all.
no, it wasn't. I mean, the environmental matrix had already been updated by the end of October to show balanced. And therefore, that response confirmed what we had in the environmental matrix. So there was really no action.
Well, if I could put it to you that you could take it as confirming what was to happen for standard bedrooms, but not for rooms in critical care, on the basis that the first point is that the ventilation was to comply with the parameters in SHTM 0301, but balanced pressure critical care bedroom not be compliant with SHTM 0301.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't looking at it in that level of detail. This was about following through process that had been raised at the various meetings. The focus was to resolve the single bedroom.
Okay. At the outset of your questions, Mr. Hall, I said to you that we'd be looking at the period up to financial close. You'll be glad to hear that we're now at the point of financial close, so we're nearly there. The financial close occurred in February 2015 when the project agreement was concluded, and it contained a number of provisions about the environmental matrix. Just to clarify, I'm not going to ask you what the contract means. That's a legal question, ultimately one for the courts, but what I am interested in is your understanding at that time, that's at the time of financial close, about the status of the environmental matrix and what was to happen with it. So we've already seen an earlier point today, the requirement in the construction requirements to comply with the environmental matrix. Paragraph 8. You remember that?
Yeah.
Now, in the contract at financial close, there are at least two qualifications in that regard. First is a derogation from IHSL's obligation to comply with the environmental matrix. The second is the environmental matrix was reviewable design data. Are those matters that you were aware of?
The derogation side was a different work stream, and again, that would be my colleague Leanne Edwards that would be able to comment on that.
Okay, were you aware that there was a derogation from compliance with the environmental matrix?
I think I can recall there was some discussion on it, but because it was a separate work stream and it was dealt with separately, I wasn't really involved in the detail of what was getting discussed.
Okay, did the existence of that derogation affect in any way how you went about dealing with the environmental matrix afterwards?
Afterwards, after financial
After
close?
financial.
It didn't change. I mean, my understanding was even after financial close that this was the board's requirements. We had, I mean, the element about the environmental matrix and the 7 points. We simply had 7 points to update the environmental matrix, and that was it resolved. And so my thinking was, that's the requirements for the project.
So that, just to make sure I've understood that, you understood the environmental matrix set out the ventilation requirements for the project, subject to points that had been raised in the reviewable design data schedule about the environmental matrix.
Yeah, so within the part 4, the wording had been that it was to be, these were the board's comments that had to go through RDD, basically. And there is evidence after financial close that shows that I took those 7 points and we fed them back to get it closed. So after we did receive financial close, there is the evidence to show that we were closing that out.
Just to we could go please to bundle 5, page 880. You may recognise this, Mr. Hall. This is part of Schedule 6, the project agreement, part dealing with reviewable design data. We see there a list of comments about the environmental matrix.
Yeah.
And we'll see that what's stated there bears some similarity to output from the meeting on the 11th of November. Is that your recollection?
Yeah. So
when you were referring to 7 points that were closed out during the reviewable design data process, are those the points that you had in mind?
They are, yeah.
So just the open question then, what did you understand to be the extent of the revisals that IHSL had to carry out to the environmental matrix through the process of reviewable design data?
My understanding was that we were to take these 7 points and update the environmental matrix with it, get the 7 points resolved, and that was it, concluded.
And if I was to put it to you that IHSL had the responsibility to review all of the ventilation parameters in the environmental matrix, check all of them for compliance with SHTM 0301, does that reflect your understanding of the task or not?
No.
Did you consider that IHSL had that responsibility in relation to any part of the environmental matrix?
No, because it was a client's briefing document that we had confirmed, we had to confirm that we were complying with it. So that type of thinking did not go through my mind.
And what about the parts that were subject of these comments in the reviewable design data sheet?
Well, these were comments that the board were telling us they wanted to be included effectively in their matrix. So it was almost an instruction to include them.
And in addressing those comments, do you accept it was the responsibility of IHL, or did you understand it was the responsibility of IHL in addressing these comments to comply with SHTMs and so on?
I think where applicable, because I recall some of these areas, you know, say the temperature going from 20 to 25, well, in some cases the SHTM is different. So it was about, again, similar to the 4-year changes, 6-year change debate, that where the client was telling you they wanted this and it was different to the SHTM, that's what we will give you because it's your requirements.
If you take the first bullet point, which is essentially about updating the environmental matrix to include rooms that aren't in it yet, do you accept that, or did you understand that it was IHSL's responsibility to make sure those entries complied with HTMs?
Yeah, well, the process was basically, we have effectively the defined list of all the rooms with the environmental parameters. So the first stage of that would have been where any were getting added in. Do we have it defined? It would simply be populating it with those requirements within any areas that were getting added or changed.
Okay, when you say defined, are you?
I think this is entirely my fault. To get the question correctly, which was IHSL under an obligation in relation to the 7 points to ensure compliance with, for example, SHTM 0301? So I've got the question. I thought entirely, Mr. Hall, could you just give me the answer to that?
Yeah, so my understanding was that where the 7 points deviated from the SHTM, for example, and I use one as temperature, then it wouldn't be the SHTM we were complying with. It was an instruction that that's what was being asked for.
I may have gotten this wrong. So that would involve an exercise in relation to the 7 point, checking what you understood to be NHSL's requirements, or what they'd asked you to do, against any relevant guidance.
Any relevant guidance or the existing environmental matrix that already defined areas and room types.
Thank you.
If we could go please to bundle 5, page 14. Now, Mr. Hall, I promised you I wouldn't ask you what the contract means, and I stand by that. But I'm going to put this particular clause of the project agreement to you. It's going to be clause 7.3.1. But before we go to that particular clause refers to something called disclosed data, which is a defined term. And I would like you just to answer this question on the assumption that disclosed data includes a version of the environmental matrix sent out with the tender documentation. That makes sense to you?
Yeah.
When we look at this clause, see the term disclosed data, just answer the question on the assumption that that tender version of the environmental matrix is included within it. Okay? We go to 7.3.1. What it says is Project Co, that's IHSL, acknowledges and confirms that it has conducted its own analysis and review of the data and has, before the execution of the satisfied itself as to the accuracy, completeness, fitness for purpose of any such disclosed data upon which it places reliance. Did IHSL, as far as you know, carry out such an analysis or review of the environmental matrix which was sent out with the tender documents?
No, because it wouldn't have been possible.
Why would it not have been possible?
Because you've not been party to a group of people that have pulled this matrix together. And so to unpick that, to understand why decisions and the reasons for what's contained within that document seems to me to be a very difficult job to do, and one that we couldn't actually drive because it would have involved clinicians, user group, estates, high scribe, and it just seems highly unreasonable request.
It might be suggested that this clause means that if IHSL elected to use environmental matrix parameters sent out with the tender document, that they did so at their own risk. All of those parameters were fit for purpose. To what extent did you understand at the time that that was a risk that IHSL had taken?
I didn't see that we'd taken any risk because it was a client briefing document.
Okay, just one final question. You said earlier on that you weren't aware in the preferred bidder period of the discrepancies in the environmental matrix that we've been discussing today. So by that I mean differences between tenure changes, critical care and HDU, the guidance notes in the matrix itself, then specification of 4-year changes for rooms and care. That's the first discrepancy. Second discrepancy is between 4-year changes for each room and 10-year changes required by SHTM 0301. Now, is it the case that you remained unaware of those discrepancies up to and including financial close?
Yeah, I mean, critical care wasn't debated to that level of detail. The Wallace Whittle were not carrying out detailed design in these areas until afterwards, and so there was no focus on those individual areas to establish that we did have an issue.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hall. I don't have any more questions for you, so thank you for your answers. Possible that others may do, so please just stay where you are for the moment.
Mr. Hall, what I'm going to do is allow about 10 minutes for the legal representative to confirm their positions. We will then resume. I'll find out what the position is, and I will then invite you to join us either to learn that there are no more questions or to respond to the questions. First of all, I'll ask Ms. McMillan to take Mr. Hall to witness. Right, we'll sit again about 3:30.
Please stand.
Ms. McLennan, as you will have anticipated, has alerted me to what is likely to occur. Mr. Barnes, I understand that you, on behalf of IHSL, have proposed a question which Mr. McLennan is happy to ask. Sorry, did I get my acronyms wrong? Well, maybe I better just treble check that I've got the right acronym. So the correct acronym is? Lothian Health Board. Right, you are Lothian Health Board. As my crib sheet, in fact, informs me. So my apologies for that. However, as you understand it, that deals with that. Now, Mr. McBrearty, you would wish to insist on your application under Rule 9.4, at least in certain respects. Is that correct? I wonder, can I ask you to come forward to the microphone?
Yes, my lord. What MacDonald wished to insist on the Rule 9 application, but only in respect of two of the paragraphs of it, those being paragraphs 5.6 and 5.9, the matters contained in there. The essential reason is that it may be said that the points which are touched upon in those paragraphs conflict with the evidence which has been given by Mr. Hall regarding his understanding of the environmental matrix. In making the points, my lord, I acknowledge entirely that both of those points relate directly to matters which post-date financial close. And of course, I make the application on the plain understanding that we're a part of the inquiry which deals only with pre-financial close matters. But points are insisted on because to some extent there is an inevitable crossover to the extent that these 2 points which are raised in my submission inform, looking backwards, whether Mr. Hall's understanding or recollection of what the position was pre-financial close would really have been correct. So it's really just asking about 2 later matters in order to try to lend colour to or to assist an understanding of what he's saying about the pre-financial close position.
How long do you anticipate taking?
10 minutes, perhaps less.
No, I think my recollection is correct. Point was made either during or after the previous Edinburgh hearing, but it wasn't fair to witnesses to, first of all, say we're wanting to go up to financial, for example, we're dealing with matters up to financial close, and then apparently depart from that. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I'm in your lordship's hands. I do understand that, and I do understand that that's why Mr. McLennan, I think, has been unwilling to ask the questions. I mean, to the extent that it is, the observation I would make is it's very limited matters. We're not going into the detail of it, but it's simply passing points which reflect upon what his understanding was pre-financial close. I do understand it's on the cusp, and of course, if your lordship takes the decision it's a matter which he would prefer not to be hearing at this stage of it, then that position will be understood and of course respected. So I'm really in your lordship's hands.
You aren't, of course, being prevented, period. I mean, if I didn't allow the application today, you're not being prevented in raising this matter, ensuring that Mott MacDonald witness is called to make the points, and indeed a multiplex witness, possibly Mr. Hall, is made available to respond. Something which I had understood, and maybe I took this from, well, I can take it from what you've said, is that it can be regarded as a challenge to the witness's credibility. I sort of accept that on one hand as pointing to allowing the question, but an investigation into credibility is a bit more nuanced than saying this happened in 2019, for example. How could you say that in 2015? Anything further you wish to say?
I don't think so, my lord. I mean, I think I would make the observation, the only following observation I would make is that, of course, I'm aware that perhaps the reason why we have decided to insist on the application is because we're aware that come the end of this part of the inquiry, parties are being asked to make submissions on everything that's
Yes.
happened up until now. And I think as things stand, with these two matters outstanding, inevitably the submissions would be, one has to bear in mind that there are these issues which cross over, and that may be another way of looking at matters. I understand that, but I think that that's really why I'm here insisting on it, is to say that inevitably I think that these matters are to be at some point in time taken into account in order to look backwards to what the position was pre-financial close. But other than that, I'm in your lordship's hands.
Is it fair of me to cast what you're trying to do, what you're at least not losing the opportunity of doing, is challenging the sincerity or the coherence of Mr. Hall's position on the status of the environmental matrix?
I think coherence would be a fair way of putting it.
Sorry?
Coherence, I think, would be a fair way of putting it. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a matter of credibility, because I wouldn't immediately fall into line with saying that it's a matter of his credibility, but coherence
Coherence of thinking rather than...
would be a reasonable way of casting, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Bertie. Now, Mr. Neal, do I understand that you would wish to be heard on behalf of Multitrack?
Thank you, my lord. It's a short point. It's the point that your lordship has already made about fairness to the witness, but also, my lord, the usefulness of this proposed line of questioning to the inquiry. As has been explained, my lord, both questions relate to matters after financial close. The second relates to a letter more than 4 years after financial close, a letter written by IHSL and not by Multiplex. And my lord, my short submission is that it is not fair to the witness who has prepared on the basis that he would be asked questions for the period up to financial close to be asked questions about a period more than 4 years after that in one case. And my lord, as far as usefulness to the inquiry is concerned, obviously these two matters are now being taken very discreetly out of the much wider context of the facts of the particular periods to which they relate. And in my submission, my lord, there is very limited usefulness to the inquiry to hear evidence in that way taken out of context in relation to documents that could well be misconstrued if they weren't seen in their proper context. Those, my lord, were the only points that I sought to make.
Thank you very much. As has been explained in the inquiry's documentation, the strong indication is given that questioning of witnesses is by counsel to the inquiry. However, in following the Rule 9, and particularly Rule 9.4 of the Inquiry Scotland Rules 2007, the inquiry allows provision for a court participants' legal representatives, where they are legally represented, to question under fairly strict time limits witnesses directly. Now, I have an application on behalf of one of the core participants, Mott MacDonald Limited, insisting on 2 paragraphs of a timelessly submitted written application. These are identified by paragraph 5.6 and 5.9 of the application. The purpose of both the identified questions is to challenge the logical coherence of evidence which the witness has given in response to the questioning of inquiry's counsel in relation to the status of the environmental matrix to which reference was made in that evidence. The application is opposed on behalf of Multiplex, another of the core participants. I propose to refuse the application in respect of both questions identified in 5.6 and 5.9. Now, this, of course, is without prejudice to exactly the same questions being raised on behalf of Mott MacDonald or addressed by any other core participant at a later oral hearing. The witness will have prepared his evidence on the assurance that he's going to be asked about events no later than financial close of contract, February of 2015. Therefore, as Ms. O'Neill reminded me, there is a question of fairness, but perhaps even more persuasive, or at least more persuasive to me, is question as to how something as potentially nuanced as the, as it were, intellectual coherence of an apparent position taken in 2019 can be tested, or rather, the intellectual coherence of a position as at February 2014 can be usefully tested by a very few questions relating to events which came after. It occurs to me that the exercise might be more complicated than that, and with every respect to Mr. McBrearty, who presented the application on behalf of Mott MacDonald, I rather doubt that a useful examination of that matter could be achieved in 10 minutes. So without prejudice to these questions arising at a later stage and being raised by absolutely anyone who considers they have an interest, I will refuse the application. However, that requires Mr. Hall to return to answer the question put forward by Mr. Barnes on behalf of H.S. Lothian. Mr. Hall, what I understand to be a fairly limited additional question or questions from Mr. McLennan.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Hall, we were looking at the period from the start of IHL's appointment as preferred bidder in early 2014 up to financial close February 2015. We also looked at the environmental matrix which had emerged in the tender documents and were available at the start of the preferred bidder period. That particular environmental matrix dated 19th of September 2012. So we have a situation in which the environmental matrix from September 2012 extends over a period up to financial close about 2.5 years later, February 2015. Now, the question is based on the proposition that guidance for things like ventilation and so on might evolve as time moves on. And we in fact know that, for example, SHTM 0301 was issued in one version in February 2013, February 2014. And so in that particular context, the question is, who did you take to be responsible checking whether or not the environmental matrix remained compliant with guidance over that period of time, taking account of the possibility that the guidance might be changing?
In the time period, could I just clarify that it's up to financial close, the period from
Yes.
2012?
Yes, so the environmental matrix issued with tender documents dated 19th of September 2012. Financial close is achieved February 2015. Who did you think was responsible for making sure that the environmental matrix remained compliant with guidance, taking account of the possibility that that guidance might be changing over that 2.5 year period?
Well, my own thoughts on it, because obviously it's not something that I was thinking at the time, it's a question I'm being asked now. So it didn't really enter my head at the period that we're talking about. But given it's a client document and it's requirements that the client's wanting, my thoughts would have been that the client would be ensuring that their requirements were still up to date as we progressed through the period. There were opportunities to inform us that the requirements were either changing or needed to be updated, and that's the reason for the submissions of the document that we spoke about in September.
Do you recall that we looked at the clause in board construction requirements addressing the hierarchy of standards? Recall that clause?
Yeah.
Do you recall that it provides as follows, that where contradictory standards and advice are apparent, most recent standard or advice shall take precedence? Now, standing that clause towards construction requirements, would your view be the same, or does that make a difference?
It doesn't make a difference to my answer, because I identified the other that there was the clause in 2.3 that where the client was asking for something specific or different, then that's what took precedence in my understanding of the documentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall. I'll just check with the, yeah, I think we're content with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tennant, and thank you, Mr. Hall. I appreciate that giving evidence the inquiry involves a lot more than just turning up, being asked to turn up for a morning and finding that you've been asked to turn up for the day, but it involves a lot of preparation. And I acknowledge that and thank you for that. But at least for this hearing, you're given your evidence and you're free to go. Thank you.
Please stand.
Should have perhaps said, I hope to, that we'll see each other again on Tuesday at 10.